Okay, my name is Brad Hunt. Today is the 26th day of December, 2027, 2022, that is. And I'm going to read chapter 2 of the Tavistock Institute since I have some energy tonight. So let's try to get this done. So this will be explaining a little bit more of what Tavistock is involved in. As we talked about before, um, a couple of individuals, but Bernays is one of the most important people involved in this. And Edward Bernays has had enormous impact uh, in the past century. That is in the 1900s. That is from basically 1920s on to the 1970s. So he did a lot here in America in advertising. He made his money that way. So let's go ahead and read this particular chapter. Okay, this is by John Coleman, and we'll start here with chapter 2. Europe falls off the precipice. Europe after World War I and the close of the Bolshevik Revolution was forced to change according to the Tavistock blueprint. When thanks to the British engendered and instigated First World War, Europe fell off a precipice into the end of their world, or perhaps it might be more appropriate to say, shambled along like zombies until the last of the air vanished into the darkness of the abyss. The forced changes became very much apparent. This is not a book about First World War per se. Hundreds of thousands of words have been written about the cause and effect. Let's see, I just missed it here. Oops. And so what I'm going to do here is I just pushed the wrong button. Hold on just a second for me as I get back into the particular book here. This will be chapter 2 with John Coleman. And okay, so I pushed the wrong button here and actually deleted it. So force changes become very much apparent. This is not a book about the First World War per se. Hundreds of thousands of words have been written about the cause and effects of the greatest tragedy ever to befall mankind. That's correct. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died in this war, folks. And yet it's not been adequately addressed and probably never will. One thing that many writers, that is myself included, all are agreed on. The war was started by Great Britain out of sheer hatred of Germany's rapid progress towards becoming a major economic power in competition against Britain. And Lord Edward Grey was the principal architect of the war. This is all about competition. And Britain didn't want to have competition. It wanted to eliminate that competition. That's my saying here. That is, was unpopular and not approved of by a large majority of British people, called for special measures, a new department to handle the challenges. In essence, that is the reason why Wellington House came into existence. And as I continue to read this here, let me explain to you something else. Trying to get this thing to work the way I want it to. Okay, there we go. So from such a small beginning, it progressed into the gargantuan Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. By 2005, the world's premier brainwashing institute and a most sinister force that it will have to be confronted and put out of business if the United States is to survive as a constitutional republic with a Republican form of government guaranteed by the 50 states. It is considered opinion of a number of members of the U.S. Senate who were consulted in preparation for this book, but who have asked not to be named. The aftermath of the First World War and the failed attempts to form a League of Nations served only to emphasize the gap between the old Western civilization and the new. The economic disaster of post-war Germany hung like the smoke, like a funeral pile over Western culture, adding to the dismal, sad, and fearful climate that began in the 1920s. Historians agree that all the combatants suffered economic ravage of various degrees, although Russia was somewhat spared, only to be destroyed by the Bolsheviks, while Germany and Austria were the hardest hit. A strange kind of a force gaggly descended on Europe in the 1920s, in which I include Britain and the United States. It was put down to rebellious youth and people generally being sick of war and politics. In point of fact, people were reacting to the long-range penetration and interdirectional conditioning of the masters at Tavistock. In the period between the end of World War I and 1935, they were as much shell-shocked as they were troops who had survived the hell of the trenches with shot and shell flying all around them. Only now, it was an economic shock and shell and vast changes in social morals that numbed their senses. But the end result of the treatment was the same. People threw discretion to the winds, and the moral rot that was set in motion in 1918 is ongoing and gathering momentum. In a state of forced gaggity, nobody saw the coming of the world economic crash and subsequently world depression. It is agreed by most historians that the condition was engineered, and we are led to believe that Tavistock played a role in the feverish, publicly campaigns of various factions in that period, and supported by a contention that the crash and depression was a contrived event. It basically says, look at the appendix of events in the last part of the book. Spinagolo foretold what was to happen. As it turns out, his predictions were amazingly accurate. Decadent society and loose women, characterized by the flappers and men in coats fitted with hip flasses, who demanded and got a lessening of female modesty that came in with higher hemlines, bobbed hair, and excessive makeup, women smoking and drinking in public. As money became harder to come by and soup kitchens and unemployment lines grew longer, hemlines grew shorter, while the writings of Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, and D.H. Lawrence drew gasps. The latest Broadway shows and nightclub acts reveal a lot more of women's hidden charms than ever before, and put them out on public display. It was noted by a fashion designer in 1919 in the New Yorker magazine that hemlines this year are 6 inches from the ground and very daring. Well, that was chapter 2. Wow, that's a pretty short chapter. Well, let's continue on here. So this is chapter 3, how times were made to change. But that was only the beginning. In 1935, with Hitler rising to power, guaranteed by the impossible conditions forced upon Germany at Versailles, hemlines were also rising to the dizzy height of the knees, except in Germany, where Hitler was demanding modesty from German womanhood and getting it along with wholesome respect, which did not suit Tavistock's book. Now, I want you to understand here, as I show you something here. This is a different book, but it's simply by the same author. Anthony Sutton also shows that the rise of Hitler. And what I'm trying to point out here simply is this. Hitler was not, there was no power vacuum here. In other words, Hitler got the money from the West. You know the reason where that money came from, and this is also what his book is also talking about. It's also about Wall Street. Same group. Again, creating the future. Creating Germany to rise again. And also the Bolsheviks. That is, eventually with the Soviet Union would be actually a allied power, which makes no sense at all with England in France and the United States. But Andrew Sutton talks about these things also in another book here, but I just wanted to show that to you. People who stopped to think at all said they hated the way times are changing, but what they did not and could not know was that times were being made to change according to a careful laid out Tavistock formula. This is what's going on, folks. In fact, almost everything now doesn't happen by happenstance. It is planned. It is planned immensely. Okay, even the music that you listen to in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, to the 70s, to the 80s, on to where we're at today, is all planned by them. Nothing happens by happenstance at all. It's more and more controlled than ever before. Everywhere else in Europe and America, the revolt was on as emancipation fever spread. In the United States, it was silent scream idols who led the way, but this was no match with what was happening in Europe, where every single pleasure was being indulged in, including homosexuality, that had long been hidden in darkness and never mentioned in polite society. Homosexuality emerged alongside lesbianism to shock, disgust, and it seemed to deliberately affront those who still lingered in the old order. A study of this aberration showed that homosexuality and lesbianism became rampant not out of any inner or latent desires, but as a means to shocking the old establishment with its rigid codes of good order. Music too suffered and went to the dogs in all manner of jazz and other decadent forms. Tavistock was now in the most crucial stage of developing its plan that called for womanhood to be reduced to a lessening standard of morality and of feminine behavior never thought possible. Nations were in a state of numbness, shell-shocked by the radical changes forced upon them which seemed impossible to stop, in which a complete absence of female modesty reflected in learned behavior attitudes that made the 1920s and the 1930s look like a ladies' Sunday school teachers convention. They looked like a ladies' Sunday school teachers convention. There was no stopping the sexual revolution that swept the world during that era and the planned degradation of womanhood that went with it. Some voices were heard, notably G.K. Chesterton and Oswald Spinnerton, but it was not enough to blunt the assault launched by the Tavistock Institute that had, in effect, declared war on Western civilization. And this is amazing when you think about this. This is a Western group. This is not a foreign entity here. This is a group within what I would call, it's in the West. It's a group within the West that is destroying the West. Now, who would do that? Think about that. The effects of the long-range penetration interdirectional conditioning were elsewhere or everywhere to be observed. The moral, spiritual, racial, economic, cultural, and intellectual bankruptcy we are in the midst of today is not some social phenomenon or the result of something abstract or sociologically that just happened. Rather, it was the outcome of a carefully planned Tavistock program. What we are seeing is not accidental, some aberration of history. Rather, it is the end product of a deliberate, induced social and moral crisis evident elsewhere, everywhere, and in such persons as Mick Jagger, Oprah Winfrey, Britney Spears, reality television shows, music seeming a Napoleon of every base entity, Fox News, near pornography movies in mainstream theaters, advertising in which modesty and decency are cast to the winds, loud, uncouth behavior in public places, especially in American restaurants, and Katie Couric and a host of other female non-entities suddenly create to become highly paid television anchors or talk show hosts, all of whom have been trained to talk in a hard, grady, monotonous voice, totally lacking in cadence, as if talking through clenched jaws in a manner that is harsh, strident, and hard on the ears. Whereas television news readers and anchormen had always been men, suddenly there were no more than a dozen men in the field. We see in the non-entity stars in the movies industry that churn out movies of an increasing low cultural standard. We see it also in the glorification of interracial marriage, divorce on demand, abortion, and blatant homosexual and lesbian behavior, and the loss of religious beliefs and in Western civilization family life. Such stars as Ellen DeGeneres, how do you pronounce it? Degeneres, who absolutely has no talent and nothing of any cultural value to offer, are held up as models for impressible young girls who are increasingly on parade with as much as 75% of their bodies exposed. We see it in a massive increase in drug addictions and all manner of social evil, as in Canada passing a law making homosexual and lesbian marriage legal under the threadbare guise of civil rights. We see it in a wholesale corruption of the political system and constitutional mayhem where this House and Senate permits blatant violations of the highest law in the land at every level of government, and nowhere more so than in the executive branch of government, where every president since Roosevelt has taken powers to which the president is not entitled. We see it in illicit taking of war powers by the president when such powers are explicitly denied to the executive by the U.S. Constitution. That's correct. We see it in a new dimension of constitutional disobedience added to an ugly list of laws not empowered by the Constitution. One of the most recent and most shocking being the U.S. Supreme Court blatantly exceeding of its powers and breaking down states' rights and electing George Bush the younger as the president. You remember that whole deal that took place with the Supreme Court had no reason to be even involved in this case, got involved. And constituted a gross contravention of the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in the history of the United States. Yet so dazed and shell-shocked on the American people that no protest was voiced, no mass demonstration, no calls for the Supreme Court to be reined in. And this one, innocent alone, the power of Tavistock long-range penetration and interdirectional conditioning proved to be a huge triumph. So what is taking place here is that there was no case law for a lot of the stuff that was taking place, especially the Chad ballots. No matter who you're voting for, that's not what they were supposed to be involved in, and they got involved in it and made it a laughing stock in the Constitution. No, this condition of disintegration of our republic in which we find ourselves in 2005. So this book was written in 2005. Did not simply evolve, rather it is the end product of a carefully planned social engineering brainwashing project of immense proportions. The truth is reflected in the death throes of what was once the greatest nation on earth. Yes, correct. The physiological conditioning papers written by the social scientists at Tavistock are working well. Your reaction in a program one. You cannot think any other way unless you make a supreme effort. That's correct, because basically they divided you. And this is my take on it. They've divided you in what I call the reds and the blues here, the right and the left, all of that. And no longer is there a moderation of what I would call a moderate deal that people are working together. It's not. It's like a fight on one side or the other. Nor can you take steps to free yourself from this condition unless you can first identify the enemy and his plan for the dissolution of the United States and Europe in particular and the Western world in general. That enemy is called the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, and it has been at war with Western civilization since its earliest days before it found form and substance at Wellington House, and from there it evolved into the present facilities at Sussex University. And the Tavistock Institute in London, before I unmasked this institution in 1969, it was unknown to the United States. It is without doubt the world's premier brainwashing social engineering establishment. We shall see what it achieved in its early days in pre-World War I England, and since then is the run-up to the World War II and post-World War II to the present time. During World War II, the Tavistock Institute was headquartered at the British Army Physiological Warfare Division. We have covered its history during its formal years at Wellington House, and we are now proceeding to the pre-World War II and post-World War II activities. So that's chapter 3. And you're going to see some major people here in chapter 4. We maybe can just do that too, because maybe we can go through this. See how long it is. Not that long. So let's go ahead and do this chapter 4 deal since I'm here. Some interesting names here. If you want to, I would suggest that you take notes of these people because these are important people. I have a friend who lives in Arizona who's I've learned quite a bit from her. She's the one that told me about Tavistock. I never heard of Tavistock 4 years ago, 5 years ago, probably. Um, and some of the names here are very important. They also, many of these came from the Frankfurt School. Okay, so this is to give you an idea when Germany World War II is taking place. Um, some of these people actually jumped ship and came to Tavistock. So chapter 4 is called Social Engineering and the Social Scientists. Dr. Kurt Lewin, Lewin, was a chief theoretician who specialized in the teaching and application of topological psychology, which was and remains the most advanced method of behavior modification. Lewin was assisted by Major General John Rawlins Reese, R-E-E-S-E, very key individual, just very important person here. Also, at Eric, E-R-I-C, Trist, T-R-I-S-T, W-R Bion, B-I-O-N, H.V. Dix, D-I-C-K-S, and several of the greats of brainwashing and social engineering like Margaret Mead and her husband Gregory Basin. These are all important people, folks. Very important. Bernays was the top consultant right up to the time when George Bush was placed in the White House by the Supreme Court. Are you aware of that? I was wrong about the numbers about him also earlier. We do not want to get too technical and thus will not get into specifics of how they apply to social sciences. Most will accept the generic term of brainwashing as an overall explanation of the activities of this, the mother of all think tanks. It is. So, when I was in political science and international relations, and there are many think tanks out there now, folks, tons of them. They've been going on for quite a while. Some have been over 100 years old. And this is used in the political science department area. These are think tanks. These are the philosophy of war, how to deal with international relations, such and such, all those things. But I'm sidestepped, so let me get back to the book here. It will come as no small surprise to learn that Lewin and his team founded the Stanford Research Center, the Wharton School of Economics, which is at Penn, is the University of Pennsylvania, and MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the National Institute of Mental Health, among scores of other institutionally fondly believed to be American institutions. During the course of years, the federal government contributed millions upon millions of dollars to Tavistock and expanded web of interlending institutes, while corporate America and Wall Street came up with matching amounts. So our government, the federal government, is actually giving money. They are. Stanford, the Wharton School of Economics, which is at Penn, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, MIT, and the National Institute of Mental Health. Continue. We make bold to say that without the amazing growth and advanced techniques for mass brainwashing developed by the Tavistock Institute, there would have been no Second World War, nor any of the wars that follow, and certainly not the two Gulf Wars, the second of which is still raging in November 2005. Well, yeah, actually the sad part simply is that war never ceased till recently in Afghanistan. By the year 2000, there were hardly any aspect of life in America into which Tavistock tentacles had not reached, and that included every level of government from local to federal, industry, trade, education, and the political institutions of the nation. Every mental and psychological aspect of the nation was analyzed, recorded, profiled, and stored in computer memory banks. What has come out of this is what Tavistock calls a three-system response and how population groups react to stress resulting from contrived situations that become crisis management exercises. What we have in the U.S. and Britain is a government that creates a situation viewed by its citizens as a crisis, and a government then manages that crisis. An example of a contrived situation was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was contrived, as previously explained herein, with the transfer of Rockefeller's cash to Richard Swords, SRRGE, the master spy, and then to the member of the imperial family to prompt Japan to fire the first shot so that the Roosevelt administration could take the United States into World War II. And I explained that earlier, that we actually had a Pacific fleet actually in San Diego, and then they chose to move it to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, so it will allow Japan an easier way to strike the battleships there and to cause World War II. And that is to get us involved in that. The economic strangulation of Japan by Britain and the United States unilaterally choking off the flow of essential raw materials to the island factory that was called Japan, had reached a point where a decision was made to put an end to it. Tavistock played an enormous role in crafting the massive wave of anti-Japanese propaganda that swept the United States into the war in Europe via war against Japan. Unbearable economic pressures were put on Japan, while at the same time the Roosevelt administration refused to negotiate until the Tokyo government could see no way out but to attack Pearl Harbor. They wanted war. That's what they wanted. Roosevelt had conveniently, obligedly shifted the Pacific Fleet, this is what I just told you earlier, the Pacific Fleet into harm's way by moving it from safe haven at San Diego to Pearl Harbor for absolutely no valid or strategic reason, thereby placing it squarely in reach of the Japanese Navy. They also would explain to you that the battleships were a line, easy way for Japanese to come in here and bomb them. Our planes were, instead of being spaced apart, were put closer together so that one bomb, if it hits, would actually destroy two airplanes. It's done on purpose. Another example is more recent, the Gulf Wars that began when a hue and cry was raised about Iraqi allegedly stocks of nuclear and chemical weapons, the so-called weapons of mass destruction. You know, folks, when they have weapons of mass destruction here, where would they get those from? Tell me, where would they get them at? How many countries have nuclear weapons? We have, let's see, we have America, Britain, France, China, Soviet Union or Russia. There are also two other players, probably South Africa and Israel are part of that also, but they're not mentioned. Where else would they get these things at? Hello? They didn't get it. You know, this is what people don't understand. They're contrived wars. The Bush administration and the Blair government knew the issue was a contrived situation without foundation of merit. They knew that there was no such weapon. Indispensable proof existed that Hussein's weapons programs had been nullified after the 1991 Gulf War and through continued brutal sanctions. In short, the two Western leaders were caught out in a web of lies, yet such is the power of the Committee of 300 and the brainwashing power of Tavistock that they remained in office, although it is as acceptable fact that because of their lies, at least 1 million Iraqis and more than 2,000 American servicemen dead, and approximately 26,000 people wounded, based upon Russia's GRU military intelligence figures, of which 53% are maimed. It's the cost in monetary terms as of October 2000 exceeding $550 billion. The Iraqi death toll is the total of both Gulf Wars, of which the majority are civilians. Who died from the lack of food, clean water, and medicine as a result of criminal sanctions imposed by the British and U.S. governments under cover of the UN. In carrying out sanctions against Iraq, the UN violated its own charter, and from then on became a crippled institution lacking credibility. It never had any credibility, folks. There is no parallel in history where a man holding the highest office proved to be a liar, deceiver, and yet could remain in power as if nothing had stained his office. A state of affairs that demonstrated the power of Tavistock Institute, long-range penetration and inner conditioning treatment of the American people that would cause them docilely to accept such a horror-filled situation without ever taking to the streets in rage. Well, did Henry IV say that people deserve the government they get if the people do nothing to turn that government out of office, such as is the right of the American people under their U.S. Constitution? Then they deserve to have liars and deceivers running their nation and their lives. On the other hand, the American people may well be going through one of the three phases of what Dr. Fred Emry, E-M-E-R-Y, at one time the senior psychiatrist at Tavistock, another key player, once described as social environmental turbulence. According to Emry, large population groups manifest the following symptoms when subjected to conditions of violent social changes, stress and turbulence, which can be divided into well-defined categories. Okay, this is what they're doing even now, in the last 2 years, with the whole thing with the coronavirus stuff. The same thing in a lot of ways, folks. It's all conditioning. Superficiality is the condition that manifests itself when the threatening population group reacts by adopting shallow sloganeering, which they attempt to pass off as ideas, which they're not. Very little ego investment takes place, making the first phase a maladaptable response because, as Emry stated, the cause of the crisis is not isolated and identified. The cause of the crisis is not isolated and identified, and the crisis and tension is not abated, but continues for as long as the controllers want it to last. You see what's going on here? It's almost, not it's not almost, it is though they look at human beings as rats. That's what they're doing. They're playing with us as rats. And they're using certain pressures of stress and all this stuff on people, just like they would be doing with rats. This is where all this quote unquote psychology stuff that people think is a great thing, they found out the weakness of man, folks, and they're using it to destroy man. The second phase of the crisis reaction, since the crisis is continuing, is fragmentation. A condition in which panic strikes, social cohesion falls apart, with the result that very small groups form and attempt to protect themselves from the crisis with little or no regard for the expense or cost to other fragmented small groups. This is a phrase Emry calls passive maladaptation, while still failing to identify the cause of the crisis. We are being experimented on, folks. That's what's going on here. Continue. The third phase is when the victims turn away from the source of the induced crisis and resultant tension. They take fantasy trips of internal migration, introspection, and obsession with self. This is what Tavistock calls disassociation and self-realization. Emry goes on to explain that the passive maladaptation responses are now coupled with active maladaptive responses. This is unbelievable, folks, what they're doing to us. Most people, even today, as he just said here, are taking fantasy trips of internal migration, introspection, and obsession with self. Okay, very clear. Emry states that over the past 50 years that experiments in applied social psychology and resultant crisis management has taken over all aspects of life in America, and the results are stored in the computers in the major think tanks such as Stanford University. The scenarios are taken out, used, and revised from time to time, and according to Tavistock, the scenarios are in operation at the present time. Translated, this means that Tavistock has the majority of the American people profiled and brainwashed. If any part of the American public is ever able to identify the cause of the crisis that have washed over this nation in the past 70 years, the social engineering structure built by Tavistock will come crashing down. But that has not yet happened. Tavistock continues to drown the American public in a sea of created public opinion. The social engineering developed by the social scientists as Tavistock have been used as a weapon during this century 2 world wars, especially World War I. The pollsters who developed it have been quite frank that they employ on the American population the same devices and methods used and experimented with against enemy populations. you're seen as an enemy here. Today, the manipulation by polls of public opinion has become a central technique in the hands of social engineers and controllers of the social sciences employed at Tavistock and its many think tanks located all over the United States and Britain. And that is the conclusion of chapter 4 tonight. So we'll stop here. We'll begin to do chapter 5. Do we have what H.G. Wells calls an invisible government? That will be another day. So I wanted to just appreciate you for listening tonight. I know it's kind of late. It needs to be gone. This needs to be put out there. It needs to be put out there for people to see what is going on, because most people are unaware of what's going on. You're being treated as some type of science. You're being treated as a scientific experiment. That's what's going on here. So I appreciate all of you being here. This was chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 tonight of the book Tavistock Institute by Mr. John Coleman. I tried to get this book actually in print, and I have been unable to get this book. I'd like to have the book actually, but I have not been able to do that. So I'm reading from a PDF file, so it's being downloaded. So I'm going to say goodnight to you guys, and hope you enjoy it. If you have any comments, please express those, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Thank you. Have a good night.